Before we get into today's episode, I'm excited to share with you a new podcast called Goodniks. We all know them, those people who just do good things in the world.
Goodniks explores the journey and meaning of doing good in the world.
I get to choose every day when I wake up whether I'm going to work for a Fortune 500 and make a ton of money or work for the movement that is the arc of moral justice.
But I realized that I also had an obligation to weaponize my privilege.
One day we said, okay, if the city's not going to do it, the state's not going to do it, if some large corporation's not going to do it, why not us?
And if there were enough of you, if you were organized enough, if you were loud enough, it would be too difficult for them to ignore you.
Goodniks, created by Jeff Leitner, hosted by Annalisa and Relay, available everywhere you listen to podcasts.
Today's episode is part of our Season 2 series on the theme of home. Welcome to another episode of Art Heals All Wounds, where we explore the intersection between art and well-being. I'm your host, Pam Uzel. I'm curious, do you have a climate change story? Some story that makes climate change real for you? In 1999, I was living in a small town on the northeastern edge of the Bay Area, right at the beginning of the Sacramento Valley area. It was October, and two friends from San Francisco were visiting to hang out and to meet my youngest daughter, Lydia, who'd been born earlier that summer. We'd planned a lazy day of swimming and a picnic, but that morning we woke up to a really irritating smell of smoke in the air. There was a grass fire burning about 100 miles away, but that smell really carries. I remember apologizing to my friends and saying, "It's so weird. In all the time I've lived here, there's never been smoke in the air." I felt really lucky that that little town where I was living didn't have big fires like the one we were smelling. The year my daughter Lydia turned 21, in the summer of 2020, wildfire tore through that same little town where we used to live, down the lane where we lived, burning the houses of our former neighbors, all the old trees I used to love, displacing and killing wildlife, pets, livestock, and people. 6 people were killed in that fire. That fire, along with 2 others burning at the same time, blanketed the skies of the Bay Area with orange smoke and ultimately burned 846,000 acres. The conversation with the guest on this episode is what inspired me to think about a story of climate change that felt personal to me and to put it in a time frame that I could really measure. Michael Snyder is a photographer, filmmaker, and educator. His work focuses on the dynamic relationship between environmental change and cultural change. The question that drives Michael is, how do we make the invisible problem of climate change visible? He uses his combined knowledge of visual storytelling and conservation to create narratives that drive social impact in an effort to push the needle on both climate change awareness and action. Today we talk about one of his projects called The Coming Coast. This project focuses on the impact of rising seas and how it will affect the Chesapeake Bay on the east coast of the United States. If we do nothing, sea levels are predicted to rise by 6 feet by the year 2100. Thinking about that feels pretty abstract though, right? What does that really mean? What would be the impact on the ecology, the infrastructure, and the cultures of the different people who will be affected by these rising waters? Michael met up with a diverse group of people who are actively working to hold back and adapt to the already rising tides and created photos with them showing exactly what the impact will be. As Michael says, Climate change is the call of our generation. If we don't get it right on that, we'll get it wrong on everything else. Michael O. Snyder grew up in rural Appalachia, a place where he was able to see firsthand the beauty of nature and the damaging effects of 100 years of ecological extraction. He originally studied to be an environmental scientist, but shifted to working as a visual storyteller because of his belief in the power of narratives to shift what it means to live well on this planet without destroying it. Michael has won an incredible number of awards for his work and has partnered with National Geographic, the Blue Earth Alliance, Patagonia, Yale University, the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, just to name a few. His work has been published numerous times. He's given many lectures, and he presented to the United Nations Climate Conference in 2021. In this episode, we talk about his project, The Coming Coast, and another film he directed called Into the Dark, which involved a study of what the ecological effects of the loss of sea ice and a warming Arctic winter might be. I also just pick his brain on what he's seeing and what he foresees in terms of efforts to mitigate some of the worst potential outcomes from a warming planet. I'm really grateful to him for letting me throw some of these questions his way, and for sharing that in spite of everything he knows, or maybe because of everything he knows, he has hope. Before we meet today's guest, I want to tell you about an app called Newsly. Newsly is an all-in-one audio super app for iOS and Android. There really hasn't been an app like Newsly before now. Newsly picks up all of the trending articles on the web and reads them to you in a natural human voice. You can find any topic you're interested in: sports, politics, or art. I've loved using this app. I listen to it when I'm commuting, or when I'm gardening, or while I'm cooking, anytime where I want to catch a little bit of news, but my hands are full or I can't stop to read. You can also find trending podcasts from over 50 countries on Newsly, including Art Heals All Wounds. Newsly has become my go-to listening app for podcasts. If you want to try Newsly yourself, just download it from www.newsly.me. And if you use the promo code ARTHEALS, you'll get a free 1-month premium subscription. I'll include all of this info in the show notes so that you can just click on the link and use the Art Heals promo to get your free trial. Now, let's meet this week's guest. Hi, Mike. Thank you so much for being on this episode of Art Heals All Wounds. Can you start by introducing yourself by telling us who you are and what you do?
Yeah, great. Well, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me. My name is Mike Snyder. I'm a photographer. I'm a filmmaker. I'm an educator. I do a little bit of work called impact production as well. And I'm based in Charlottesville, Virginia. And I mostly work on social justice and environmental related stories. And that's lived in a lot of different capacities over the years and in a lot of different ways. But today I principally make short documentary films, and I do photojournalism is the primary work that I do.
Right. And I, of course, was looking at your website and reading your bio. Can you talk about where you're from and how that's affected your career trajectory and your subject matter?
Yeah. So I grew up on, as a kid, it felt like a very large plot of land. I think in reality, it was just a few acres. But in rural Appalachia, right near the border of Western Maryland and West Virginia. And it was a place that I just fell in love with as a kid. We had a big family. I'm the eldest of 5. And so, I very quickly was put to the woods because, I was capable of fending for myself. There were younger kids to look after. And so I just really fell in love with being in outdoor spaces. I think it was probably my first love affair. And I was very committed from a young age to finding a way in my early adult years and later adult years to having a career that allowed me to be outside. So that was a big part of my drive towards environmental work and towards, a photography and filmmaking career that would allow me to travel But the other side of that is it was also land that had been disfigured by 100 years of industrial extraction. And so, I grew up very close to what the costs are of that, both socially and environmentally. And so I became very passionate about environmental issues, both what they do to the ecology, but also what they do to the populations that live nearby to those places. So I studied environmental science and geology at the undergrad level, and then at the graduate level at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, I did a degree in environmental sustainability. And afterwards, I worked as a consultant. I worked for nonprofits. But as time went on, I came to two realizations that have really led me to the work that I do today, and sort of moved me in this transition towards visual storytelling. And the first is that, I believe that climate change is just fundamentally the call of our generation. I think almost no matter how you cut it, if we don't get it right on climate change, we get it wrong on everything else. And the reason for that is that climate change has the potential to impact every other part of our lives. Right. So if there's an issue you care about, whether it's national defense or food security or whatever it may be, you should also care about climate change, because it's going to reach out and touch those things. So, I started feeling more and more that if I want to have a career that is meaningful, that's the area that I want to work in principally. And second, and the thing that I think I was just most flabbergasted about in my graduate studies was, despite what we know of 50 years and more of environmental science and indeed climate science, despite what we know, we just really have not moved the needle nearly enough in terms of public understanding of the issue and more importantly, action on this issue. And the truth is, we already have a lot of the tools that we need to make the transition towards a more sustainable world. We've got a lot of the science, the policy and technology, not all of it. There are things that are coming online every day. But the truth is, we're just not doing nearly enough with it. And this question, which is the gap between what we know and what we value and what we do about it, is called the value action gap. I got very interested from a research perspective in how do we narrow that? How do we really move us to a place where we're actually doing something about this? And it's sort of too big of a research question to unpack here, but where I landed is storytelling, and in particular, visual storytelling is an incredibly, incredibly powerful tool, particularly when it's yoked to science on one end, emotional sort of character-driven stories on the other, and finally connected to impact organizations to make use of that content when you create it. If you build those partnerships and you design stories in the right way, they have a lot of potential to make a difference. So the end result of that is 10 years ago when I moved back to the US, 11 years ago now. I started a production company called Interdependent Pictures, and I started partnering with nonprofit organizations to help them tell their stories. That's a long way of saying that there's a thread that's kind of run through my whole life that I certainly feel connected to, but sort of how I deliver that has changed over the years.
That's interesting. I want to talk about one of your projects specifically, but I want you to just go into a little bit more detail about this idea of value action.
Well, again, so the value action gap is the separation between what we know and what we ostensibly value and what we actually do to, protect those things. And, the idea here is, and this is an idea that has been rooted in media for environmental issues for 50 years, and certainly for the last 30 years, has been, if people just knew and they just understood what the problems were, by gum, they'd do something about it. And so a lot of the work that was done was very information heavy, very science heavy. And I don't mean to say that those aren't really important efforts. I mean, certainly raising scientific literacy is absolutely essential. But it turns out when you take a deeper dive into individual psychology and indeed into collective psychology, that information alone it turns out it's not really how we make the decisions we make about our lives. We're much more complicated creatures than that. We're just not machines. And that's a wonderful thing about humans. And it's also occasionally a very terrifying thing about humans. But we're wrapped up in these narratives. And these narratives are held individually, and they're strongly based on personal experience. They're strongly based on emotional connection. They're also strongly based on tribalism. We tend to adopt the stories and perspective of people that are around us. So we're extremely normative creatures. And so it's not enough to reach individuals. We have to reach groups. It's not enough to just give information about the stories. We've got to connect it to, meaningful emotional experiences. And it's certainly not enough to just present the problem. And that's one of the critical pieces. We can't just say, okay, here's climate change, here's how it works. We have to do a few more things. One, we got to look critically about these issues. We got to say, why does this exist? We got to think about the broader social context that gave rise to this in the first place. But what we really have to do, and we so often don't, is we have to talk about how do we solve this issue? And that's one of the critical pieces. If people look at a piece of environmental media and it just leaves them with this very dire outlook, and a lot of time it is bad news, then people tend to retract, actually. There's a feeling of hopelessness. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm going to go do something more fun and entertaining than this because this is horrible. But if we give people a sense for hope and a sense for solutions, and look, there's lots of reasons to be hopeful, and there are lots of solutions, then all of a sudden it feels much more manageable. And so it's not even just about giving people knowledge. It's the kinds of knowledge that we're giving people. And hopefully this multidimensional approach to knowledge will put people in a position where they think, okay, hey, I care about this. There's something I can do about this. And here's an action that I'm going to go and take.
Wow. Thank you for that. That really is a great way to focus your work and a great way to understand how we achieve some change. I want to talk about this project that you've been working on called The Coming Coast, because I think this idea of water and how the oceans are going to rise is a very abstract one for most people, because it seems like it's happening at a pace that maybe is not understandable to people. And it also seems like it's very far in the future. So can you talk about this project, The Coming Coast?
Yeah, great. Well, let me just set the scene just a little bit first on what the issue is that gives rise to the project. So with climate change, we know that sea level rise is going to be one of the outcomes. And the reason why we're going to have rising seas is really down to three things. The first is that we're melting a lot of ice, and particularly at either end of the planet. And so that addition of water in the ocean is going to rise the oceans, just like filling up a bathtub. But also there's the issue of thermal expansion. As you heat up water, like you heat up almost anything else, it expands. So we're expanding water. And the third part, and this is a little bit more unseen, but as you throw more heat energy into our ocean systems, you increase the likelihood of storms. So it's not even that seas are rising, but being nearer to the seas is dangerous. So it's the combination of all of those things. So that's the issue. Now, the impact that it's going to have is that most people around the planet are relatively close to the ocean. And a lot of our infrastructure is very close to the ocean as well. So what this means is that by the end of the century, we anticipate in North America alone, there could be somewhere between 4 and 13 million migrants that'll have to move back from where they are to be able to get away from rising seas. So we're talking about truly mass human migration. And that's not even to speak of all the infrastructure that will be lost. So it's an enormous issue. Right now, it's already happening. There's plenty of places around the planet that are already being deeply impacted by this. There are people that are already on the move. But the big thing is here, we're just starting into this issue, right? So we've got to be looking at these frontline communities now and saying, okay, how is this playing out? What are the solutions here? If we can't adapt, how do we meaningfully migrate? Okay, so that's the issue that underlies The Coming Coast. And for the last 7 years, I've been documenting sea level rise issues through another project called Eroding Edges. And that's all about going into these communities, seeing what they're doing, try to understand their perspectives and experiences and changing identities in light of this issue. But then in 2020, I ended up getting a fellowship from the Bertha Foundation. It's a climate journalism fellowship. And I was so excited because it was finally going to fund me to be able to, expand Eroding Edges to where I wanted it to be. But of course, COVID came in and everything got turned upside down. So I suddenly had to think very creatively about how to do this project in a way that fit within the boundaries that COVID was setting. And in some ways, I think it's an interesting story about, how, when you're limited, that there's a potential for creativity within that. And I think this project wouldn't have happened hadn't it have been for COVID. So that's what gave rise to the project. Here's what the project is. My observation was that in documenting sea level rise in these communities for the last 7 years, sea level rise is one of these issues that is everywhere, at once. If you're close to the water, it's happening. It's happening all around you all the time. And yet it's mostly invisible because the rise is only happening at 3 millimeters on average per year. right? So just changing a little bit every single year. Some days you can walk out to the land feels very, very dry. You don't get a sense on a day-to-day basis this is changing. You need to be able to take a view of time, right? In a sense of time, it's happening very, very quickly. I mean, if you take a view over 30 years, which is a very short period of time, just part of one person's life, then you can see that change. So we're just not hardwired to be able to think in 30-year timescales. We're definitely not hardwired to be able to think in 1,000-year timescales, which is how most geophysics on the planet operate, is thousands to tens of thousands or millions. But even at 30-year timescales, we're not very capable of understanding. So it's on one hand, it's omnipresent, on the other hand, it's invisible. So the question is, how do we make the invisible problem more visible? And I was going to have to do that in a creative way. So I did 4 things for this project. The first is I did quite a bit of mapping. I took data from Climate Central, which is a wonderful mapping organization, and I built high-resolution maps of the Chesapeake Bay. So that's the area that I decided to work in. And the reason I was working in the Chesapeake Bay, that's in between Maryland and Virginia, for folks that don't know it, is it's basically ground zero when it comes to climate change, sea level rise. It will be one of the most highly impacted places in the U.S., among a few others, including places like Louisiana and parts of Alaska, Florida, certainly as well.
And then also, just to be more specific, that's where our capital is, correct?
Well, that's right. Not only is it a place that has enormous ecological value. I mean, this is it's the 3rd largest estuary on the planet, home to thousands of endemic species. I mean, it's basically a filter for the whole of the Central East Coast. But it's incredibly important because 18 million people live there. And the nation's capital is there. Mm-hmm. We've got the big portion of our naval fleet centered in the Chesapeake Bay. So it's important strategically, it's important infrastructurally. It's a really, really critical space. And of course, there's some wonderful cultures that have come out of there, that have been there. I mean, this is where settlers from Europe first landed, English-speaking settlers, I should say. And then, of course, before that, for 10,000 years or longer, there's been people living on the east coast of the U.S. So it's got enormous significance in a lot of different dimensions. And it's also going to go underwater. So that's where I decided to work. So I mapped the bay. And then once I had mapped the bay, and I wanted to map to forecast what 6 feet of sea level rise would look like by the year 2100. That's the bar that I set. And the reason I chose 6 feet is 6 feet is roughly where we're heading if we do nothing. Right. And I don't think we're going to do nothing, but I wanted to show us, this is where we are heading within a range of uncertainty. But, generally speaking, this is where most experts would agree we're heading if we don't act now. So I created that map. And then the goal was to travel this new coastline, the coming coast, as it were, all the way around the bay. And as I would go around, I would take blue tape and mark along the ground to show where this coastline would be. And the idea is to be able to say, hey, look, in quite possibly my children's lifetime, we're going to have water here. And sometimes the here might be right in the middle of a town. It could be in a backyard. It could be in a playground. It could be cutting through the parking lot of a shopping mall. But places that might look relatively dry are not going to be if we don't do something about it now. So that was the first component of it. And the second component, and just as important, is I reached out through networks, spent a lot of time, about a year, making connections to find 31 individuals all around the bay. And my goal was to find as diverse of a set of people as I possibly could. And then to ask them, why, and the criteria underneath that, they had to be individuals that were being impacted by sea level rise and also cared about this issue. But once I had established that criteria, I wanted to get as diverse of a group as possible. And the reason is because I think there's thousands of different reasons to care about climate change. As I said at the beginning of this session, it's something properly understood everyone should care about. There's so many different reasons, regardless of what politics you hold or religious perspective you may hold or age that you are. There's a lot of different reasons. And so I wanted to have a diverse group of people and speak to them about their reasons for caring about climate change to show this is normal. This really can and should be normal, regardless of your background or your identity. So I did an oral history with each one of them, about a 3-hour interview, asking them those questions, really trying to get to the heart of their beliefs and their experiences. And then I had them hold a depth stick, showing at a place that they chose what 6 feet of sea level rise would look like. So I packaged that all up together, and this was published in BuzzFeed News to coincide with the climate conference in November of 2020. And there will be a show of the images and the work that's rolling out in the Chesapeake Bay. 2 shows, actually, one in March of 2022, one in July of 2022, and another magazine publication that's coming out. So it's very fresh, and I'm excited about what this does to support the conversation that's ongoing in the Bay.
Of course, the first thing that pops into my head is, how did you feel going to the climate summit that you attended? I know from social media that you were there. A lot of people were angry. A lot of people felt like there's a lot of lip service. What did you walk away feeling?
So I was an observer delegate in the blue zone of the UN Climate Conference several months ago. Again, this is November of 2021. And that means I got to be in the space where the rest of the international delegation was. And I was there because I was presenting a film that I had made about climate change in the Arctic. And that's what got me into the blue zone. But I was also in several other spaces showing photographic work and talking about the role that visual storytelling plays in driving impact around these issues. So that's how I got there. I think personally, you go to those places, you say your piece, and you hope in some small way it makes a difference, just like you do in any other line of work. You plant your seeds, you stake your flag, and you hope that it might add up in a small way. So, I think I left feeling like I'm doing what I can do, and I'm saying what I feel like needs to be said. But it is true that when you look at the trajectory of the international conversation over the last 30 years, it's certainly disappointing. I mean, it's not where we need to be. We're not heading in the right direction. We are making lots of progress, but it isn't enough. And most people that understand this issue know that it isn't enough. That said, there are certain areas we are making quite a bit of progress, and there actually is plenty to be hopeful for. And while we do need international agreements, we're not going to get there without international agreements. We need that piece of the puzzle. There's still a lot that's really exciting that's happening around the planet on regional levels, on local levels, on individual levels. There's businesses that are taking they're becoming leaders as well. So it's a mixed bag. But at the end of the day, there is plenty of reasons to be hopeful for, but also a lot more we need to fight and we need to push on.
You talk about this term that I'd love for you to talk about here on the show. I believe it's meaningful migration.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about that? Because you put out some numbers earlier about the number of migrants just within this country alone. So talk about meaningful migration. What do you mean when you say that?
Well, climate migration is already happening again. And the numbers I was giving you, 4 to 13 million by the end of this century, that's just from sea level rise. But there's lots of other reasons why people will migrate. Food security issues, desertification, impact from storms, melting permafrost. There's a lot of different ways climate change is going to move people around. And the outcomes from that don't necessarily need to be all bad. There's certainly, there can be some upsides to that, but it's going to be an enormous challenge. And the term meaningful migration, what it refers to is, first is the understanding that, look, migration is going to be happening. We would love to be able to tell ourselves a story where we can use our human ingenuity to adapt the spaces that we're in and find a way to stay put, so people that are people of place can continue to be in that place. And there are some places on this planet that I'm sure we will be able to adapt, and there's great historical stories about that. Clearly places like the Netherlands that have found a way to live with the sea, give us some hope that okay, there are certain places that we might be able to stay in. But for many, many people, particularly people without privilege and without access to capital, that's just not going to happen. So if you know that migration is very, very likely to happen, and indeed almost certain to happen in some spaces, the question is, how can we make that move, but also hold on to a sense of who we are, hold on to our relationships with the community that we have been embedded in? How do we hold on to our stories? How do we hold on to our language? How do we keep the best of who we are while also embracing the change that needs to happen? And I think that question is a question that we all need to ask ourselves, because the truth is we're living in times of great, great change. And, we've all got to all be thinking about, how do we, hold on to things that are really important to us while also accepting and adapting. But it's very, very heightened for these communities that are being directly impacted by climate change. So the way that that's manifesting and the way those conversations are going, I think differs a lot community to community. In some communities that I've worked in and talked to, it's been very, very intentional and community led. And, oftentimes I have to say in tribal communities, indigenous communities, the process has been much more intentional. And then in whiter communities, less so. Now, that's not universally the case. There's some places that are white that have had strong leadership in this area, but it varies. There are plenty of places that are not having the conversation at all. They're just not having it. They might be having it around the dinner table, but as a community, they're not having the conversation. So there's a lot of variance on where communities are with this.
Yeah. And I just, I'm sorry, I'm kind of asking you to answer every single climate change question that I have. But one thing that I feel is that in terms of our own immigration system and how we view both migration to this country and also people who are essentially refugees, I'm a little bit discouraged that this issue of the impact of changing climate never really enters the conversation. Certainly, I've read a lot about Central America, where, as you said earlier, desertification is a huge factor in terms of pushing people to leave. And what do you feel about how do we get that to be part of the conversation? The reason it feels, it's important now, but I also feel like at some point, many of us may be forced to migrate. And if we can't get it now, how are we going to do this when it starts happening on a much larger scale?
Well, I'll speak to the first part of your question first and take the example of Central America. There are a significant number of migrants that are heading northwards from Central America into Mexico, into the United States, that we can certainly say are climate migrants and comfortably say that. I think at this point in time, I have not looked at the figures. I've been much closer to photography and filmmaking in the last couple of years than I have been to the policy and the studies on these things. But I did read a report in the fall that was giving something like 15, 20%, we can directly say, are moving directly because of the changing climate. But what the report also talked about that I think is really important to understand about climate migration is that the reasons why people migrate are diverse. And it might be because there's increasing violence in their town. For example, it could be because of economic issues, like the jobs in their community are not there. But what is often unseen is what might underlie that is the changing climate, right? So you might have a situation where fields continue to go more and more fallow in an area because they're not getting as much rain. And that means the community can't rely on farming as much. So then they have to change over to the drug trade. And then all of a sudden there's more violence. And then when you ask why they're fleeing, they'd say, well, because of the increased violence. But actually, climate was a catalyzing force. And so it's very difficult to pick apart what actually causes people to migrate. And so I think in some ways it's left out of the conversation because it's not entirely clear what role climate plays, but we know it is a role, and we know that it's going to become more and more of a role as time goes on, but oftentimes it will be hidden. So I think it gets sticky. I think it gets complicated. To be honest, I'm just not an expert I have no idea what people are thinking about how we're going to manage. I've seen some astronomical numbers, again, in terms of where people be heading. And if things go really, really bad, it may be true that we could be heading north. That's truly not impossible. Again, I'm in Virginia, so I'm in the South of the United States, and there's a lot of forecasts that show in the next 70 years, now we're moving, probably past the end of my lifetime, but in my children's lifetime, there could be a lot of water stress here and a lot of heat here if we don't get this right. So I have no idea how this will be managed, but I do know there are some cities around the planet that are already identifying themselves as climate refugee hubs. I believe Buffalo, New York is one. Toronto's got a plan in place now to be able to accept people that are moving out of harm's way.
That's fascinating. I think I mentioned in my email to you that, of course, on my mind here in California, it's always about fire. But the displacement that's happened around fire already is enormous. There are certain places where people moved there because they were much cheaper than trying to live in an urban area in California. And they've been displaced. And the question is, well, where do they go? Do they become part of this very, very large number of people who are houseless in California? So I feel like now this is our time to sort of get these issues right. And so I really appreciate the work that you're doing. You mentioned a film you worked on, and I'm wondering if you can tell us where we can find your work. Is it possible to see that film that you worked on? and sort of see announcements about the exhibit of your work or the publication of your work?
Well, let me speak to the film first. So, as I said, I split my time between creating different kinds of media. I typically say I like to make ecosystems of media, meaning that I'll find a story and I'll build access to that story. But once that's in place and I've kind of got the ball rolling, I've built the collaborations and the partnerships, a little bit of funding is there. As often as I can, I want to take that story and shop it out to different ways to tell stories. So that might mean, doing a documentary film. It might mean doing an explainer video series. It might be doing a photo piece. It might mean doing a written part. It might have a book or it might have a podcast associated with it. And so a lot of work that I do, it sort of spreads out. And there's a lot of different reasons for doing that. But the core one is that we need to reach diverse audiences. And if you can tell the same kind of story and tell it in different ways, in different kinds of spaces, you may indeed be able to reach different groups of people. And I think that's really, really important. So this film that I recently made called Into the Dark, and I'll explain what that is, but it's one of a number of different pieces of media that I made around this story, and I made in collaboration with other storytellers. So it's a film about the changing Arctic. And in this case, a group of climate scientists go on a 3-week expedition during the polar night. And the polar night is the time of year during winter in the Arctic where the sun doesn't rise for 4 to 6 months out of the year. So it's the dark time, and it's a very, very cold time. And it's quite a treacherous time. Very, very few people head to the North Pole during wintertime, as you can imagine. And so this is one of the teams around the planet that does. And the reason that they do is that they had this kind of rogue hypothesis a number of years ago that actually the polar night is a critical time of year ecologically. There's actually a lot that's going on up there. The belief was there's nothing going on because it's dark, so there's no primary production, meaning there's no plants growing, so nothing's eating. You can't see a mate to reproduce, so everyone just kind of goes to sleep. But what it turns out is this ecosystem, and we find this all over the planet, is just amazingly fine-tuned, adapt to work in the conditions that it's in, right? So it can take tiny, tiny, tiny amounts of light, a millionth of what we can see, and use that little bit of light to do its business, whether it's finding a partner and reproducing or whether it's eating. And so once they had discovered this, the question is then, well, wait a minute, if we have climate change and we're melting the sea ice and we don't have that cover over the ocean during wintertime, then we know there's a little bit of light that's bouncing on the upper atmosphere, coming from the sun on the other side of the planet, but also coming from stars, the northern lights. What's that doing to the ecosystem? So that's what they were up there to discover. So it's an adventure story about getting on a ship and going out to sea for weeks in a very frozen and forbidding place. And indeed, when we were working on this film, we were the northernmost people on the planet, almost certainly. We were about at 80 degrees north latitude. And the second part of it is sort of telling the story of the science. And really, it's about how sometimes tiny changes in ecosystems can lead to surprising impacts. Other times ecosystems are very robust and resilient, and you don't get these things. But there are certain times when you make a little tweak, and it can change something way off over here in left field. And indeed, when we got back and the film came out, it premiered at the Tromsø International Film Festival in 2020, and then it premiered at the DC Environmental Film Festival also in March of 2020. And at the same week, a piece came out in National Geographic, and there was a publication in Nature that confirmed what they had believed was happening, and that is there's likely to be large-scale impact from this change. There's also a series, an explainer video series that came out in Vox as well. So to answer your question, there's a lot of different ways people can check out this story. You can go to Vox and search for Thaw. You can go to National Geographic and search for my name and Dark Arctic. If you Google that, you'll probably find it. And then the film Into the Dark is currently being distributed by New Day Films, which is an educational distributor. So they work with schools and libraries all around the country. And you can go and you can stream it through New Day. And it's also on Canopy, which is another space where you can see a lot of different films. So there's a lot of different ways to engage with that media.
That's wonderful. And then just to find out more about you in general, where should people look? Yeah,
michaelosnyder.com. You can go to my website and check out my work there. You'll find my email there. If you have any questions, I'm always up to connect, so feel free to reach out. And I do publish on Instagram, so that's at Michael O. Snyder, and you can see more of my work there as well.
Thank you so much. I mean, interestingly enough, it does make me feel hopeful to talk to you, because I feel like with the sort of more creative thought about how to get people to care about this issue, that there is more hope than I thought before we talked. So thanks for coming on the show, Mike.
Yeah, it's really great to be here. And, I'll just close by saying, look, we live in a completely fascinating time. I mean, the fact that we're afforded this ability to be able to see these processes that are truly global in scale, and are incredibly complex. The fact that we've gotten to this space as a species to be able to understand this is phenomenal. And the fact that we're responding the way we are actually is phenomenal. It's an incredible story what's happening. More and more people all over the planet are coming online to caring about this issue, doing something about this issue. And the truth is science is going to have a huge role to play. And we look at the last few years and what we were able to do, whether people understand it or not. The presence of these vaccines is a phenomenal science story that we were able to respond. So, I think science is going to make a huge difference. I think our sense of community and the sense of connection and love we have for each other and for this planet, it's going to kick in. I think we're going to get there. I just think there's going to be some bumps along the way. And so I think we've got to do everything we can do to strengthen those connections as much as possible. I think that's what's going to pull us through. We're only as good as our webs that we find ourselves in. So we've got to do a much better job of building those webs and telling the right story. And I think if we do that, I think not only will we avoid the worst of what may be, but there's opportunities here and there's a better planet we could be building.
Wow. Thank you for that. You're listening to Art Heals All Wounds. I'm so grateful to Michael Snyder for being a guest on this episode of Art Heals All Wounds. Please visit his website, www.michaelosnyder.com, where you can see his project, The Coming Coast, as well as his many other works. I asked Michael to recommend some organizations that he thinks we should check out and support, and he suggested Rain Coast Conservation Fund and Bill McKibben's Third Act. I'll put links to both of these in the show notes, as well as a link to Michael's website. The music you've heard in this podcast is Yellow Light District by Lobo Loco. Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 15 in D major was performed by Karine Galadian. The two additional pieces of music used in the intro were by Remus and Ketsa. This podcast was edited by Eva Hristova. Thank you for listening to this episode today. I hope that it inspires you, as it did me, to think about your personal story about climate change. My biggest takeaway from my conversation with Michael is the importance of finding common ground so that we can meet a future that will definitely be full of challenges. What was your biggest takeaway?